Washington Journal continues.
Marianne Lavelle is a senior editor at U.S. News and World Report and co-author of this special report, Overselling Ethanol. For all the hype, is it really the answer? Well, let's start with that question. Is ethanol really the answer to our energy problems?
Well, there's no energy solution that is compelling as ethanol, because not only does it allow us to put a stick in the eye of OPEC, but help the American farmer. So what could be better than that? But like a lot of things that seem too good to be true, it really is. Ethanol has a role to play in helping our energy situation. But along with ethanol, we've got to do the hard work of increasing the fuel economy of cars and really conserving energy, all of the things that have been so hard for us to do over the last few years. It's been easier for us to just pump out more ethanol.
Why is ethanol viewed as a way of lessening our dependence on foreign oil?
Well, what we've been doing over the years is increasing the amount of ethanol that we produce and mixing it with gasoline. Now almost all of the gasoline on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and in the Midwest is 10% ethanol. And theoretically, that could help us reduce our dependence on oil. Unfortunately, ethanol doesn't go as far as oil does. It takes 1.5 gallons of ethanol to drive us as far as a gallon of gasoline. So even though we're producing more and more ethanol, we're also using more and more gasoline. So we really are just taking a little nibble out of our oil dependence. But at the same time, we are taking gobbling huge amounts of our corn crop. And so there are all sorts of consequences to the course that we're on.
We're talking about the politics of ethanol with Marianne Lavelle of U.S. News and World Report. If you'd like to get involved in the conversation, the number's on the screen, 202-737-0001 for Republicans, 202-737-0002 for Democrats, and independents can call us at 202-628-0205. Reminder, if you've called us within the last 30 days, send us an email instead. The address is journal@c-span.org, and also when we punch you up and we take your call, remember to turn down your volume so that you don't get a feedback. Tell us about the beginnings of ethanol. Ethanol goes back to almost the turn of the century, the turn of the last century, and the invention of the car, and it was seen as a competitive fuel alternative to gasoline. Henry
Ford made his first autos able to run on either ethanol or gasoline. We didn't know which way things would turn out. As it turned out, petroleum over the years was cheaper than ethanol, and the whole industry moved in that direction. We became oil dependent instead of using grain. And so for years there was some ethanol production here and there, but it wasn't until the 1970s and the oil shocks, the Arab oil embargo, that we began to think, well, why don't we invest and subsidize a homegrown fuel that can really take the place of oil. And so the Congress, in a big way, started to put some backing behind ethanol. And that really kicked into place 1978, 79, 80, and we started making more ethanol subsidized. The biggest producer was Archer Daniels Midland at that point. And something happened in the late 80s. Oil prices dropped again. And we kind of forgot about how important it was to have a homegrown fuel. And we were able to get all the oil we wanted. So through the late 80s and especially the 90s, with the rise of the SUV, we became more and more oil dependent. Our oil dependence increased to 60% of our oil is foreign imported. All the time, ethanol has been produced in the Midwest, but it was kind of a niche fuel. It was mixed in there. It was cheap to transport in the Midwest, et cetera. And it wasn't really until, I'd say, the year 2000 that folks looked to ethanol as something bigger than just a niche fuel in the Midwest.
What is it about the production of ethanol that makes it more expensive to manufacture than to manufacture gasoline?
There are a lot of steps to it, and really you're putting the corn out there in the field, you're fertilizing it, you're running diesel fuel to really to harvest it, to we have a picture in our magazine of a bunch of trucks lining up at an ethanol plant, and to me that photo explains that even to transport the corn to the ethanol plant, you've got to have a bunch of trucks running diesel fuel to get there. There are a lot of steps involved in making ethanol, although the industry has really improved its profile over the last few years and has increased its energy efficiency. So many small ethanol producers have got into the game, and they've taken market share away from Archer Daniels Midland. ADM is no longer as dominant as it once was, and so the ethanol industry has really improved its game and made it cheaper to make and used less energy. Still, it is very dependent on what the price of oil is, because if the price of oil is high, ethanol production is very profitable. If the price of oil is low, it's harder to really make that industry work.
Marianne Lavelle of U.S. News and World Report is our guest, talking about the politics of ethanol. Our first call comes from Waldorf, Maryland, on our line for Independence. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Hello?
Yes,
Hello.
sir. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I understand that in order to make ethanol, it takes somewhere between a gallon to a gallon and a half of gasoline in ratio, so I don't understand how it's beneficial to use ethanol.
It's really interesting because this is a topic of a lot of debate. Does it take more energy to make ethanol than it does, than the ethanol gives us? And a lot of studies have done. Only one has really shown that it had kind of a negative net energy balance. The Congressional Research Service last year concluded that, on balance, ethanol gives more energy than it uses. However, there is still a big problem with greenhouse gas production from ethanol because of the diesel used in the harvesting, in the transporting of corn. We even use fertilizers that are petroleum-based for corn production. And then there's heat used in really turning that grain into alcohol. And so indeed, it's a slight energy positive for ethanol, but we could do better than that if we went into new forms of ethanol, and that's what the president talked about, and you'll hear them on Capitol Hill talking about this too, cellulosic ethanol, which is a complicated concept, but it is a way of making ethanol that addresses that energy balance problem that you talked about.
Our next call comes from Newport Richey, Florida, on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning. Hi. Thank you very much for C-SPAN. How are you today?
Just fine, ma'am. What's your question?
I'm calling from Florida, and I have a couple issues. U.S. reporter, U.S. News and World. Number one, can you please tell me a little bit about what's happening on the Capitol debate regarding ethanol? And you kind of answered some of my questions regarding the cost. The corn and the ADM issue that you just previously mentioned, is that a publicly traded area that's kind of become a crossover for capital gain in the U.S.? I mean, like, could we sell this to other countries?
Well, let me answer a few of your questions. What's happening on Capitol Hill is the Farm Bill this year is being talked about as the energy bill of this year, because the idea is to really increase ethanol production in that bill, increase the mandate for ethanol production, give more support, give some more support to these new forms of ethanol. So definitely Capitol Hill is talking ethanol this year, and we can't forget that it's a presidential contest that begins in Iowa, and Iowa is the biggest ethanol producing state. So you're going to be hearing a lot on the political front about ethanol. ADM is still the largest producer of ethanol, but it only has 20% of the market. Remember, in the year 2000, it had 40% of the market. So that's how many smaller players have come in. Several other publicly traded companies have entered the fray. So there's a company called Verasun that's the #2 ethanol maker, very, very big. There are a few other publicly traded companies. There are a lot of private farmers' cooperatives that are making ethanol. We are not exporting ethanol at this point. We're using so much of it that the problem is we need to import ethanol. We actually imported ethanol from Brazil last year because prices were so high. There's an issue there because we have a lot of trade barriers, tariffs that prevent Brazilian ethanol from coming into this country. And you know, the corn industry doesn't really like the idea of lifting that barrier. Some people say we should lift that barrier and it would make ethanol cheaper for everyone.
Does the subsidies in Brazil offered to their ethanol industry, is that what accounts for the difference between Brazilian ethanol and American ethanol?
Certainly, Brazilian ethanol has been subsidized for years. They make their ethanol from sugarcane, and it actually is cheaper for them to make ethanol from sugarcane than it is for us to make ethanol from corn. So there's that difference as well. So definitely the tariffs that we have are very effective in keeping Brazilian ethanol out, except for last summer when everything got to be so expensive. Gasoline was expensive, ethanol was expensive, and it was worthwhile for us to import it.
If the U.S. were to go to growing sugarcane in order to produce more ethanol, would that bring the cost of U.S. ethanol down?
Interestingly, there have been studies done that found that making ethanol from sugarcane in this country would not be as inexpensive as it is in Brazil. The one area where they're looking at doing that is Hawaii, where the climate and everything is really much more geared to sugarcane.
The next call for Marianne Lavelle comes from Flint, Michigan, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning. I'm not going to go on at long for a long time, but I'd like to ask you, in your article, which I read, you didn't mention anything about the auto industry not producing flex fuel cars. And you didn't mention anything, and I'm not saying this is wrong. It was very nice to read the article about sugar beet production. Michigan produces thousands of acres and thousands of pounds of sugar beet, Big Chief Sugar up in Bay City, Michigan. And I've never read any article, yours included, about processing sugar beets into ethanol. And I didn't also read about biodiesel. And biodiesel is becoming big in the South and Texas, making it from cottonseed, running it in trucks and tractors. But what we debate here in Michigan, with Michigan's economy being so poor and we making cars here and sugar beets, we don't find flex fuel cars. And the current president of General Motors, Mr. Wagner, was the gentleman in Brazil for 10 years that developed flex fuel computerized carburation for cars so that Brazilians could run their cars on alcohol. That's another article I've never read anywhere.
Thanks for your call, sir.
Right. Well, let's talk about the flex fuel cars. In much of the Midwest, parts of the Midwest, let's say, you can get something that's called E85, which is 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline. Most places you just have a 10% ethanol mix. E85 would be great in theory because we would really take a bite out of our oil dependence then. Unfortunately, you can't run on E85 on most of the cars in America. Only 2 to 3% of cars are so-called flex fuel vehicles, vehicles that could run on either alcohol or gasoline, the kind that Henry Ford made. It's not hard to make a flex fuel vehicle. It costs, I've heard, maybe $100 more to make a car into a flex fuel vehicle. But our tradition has been to have the petroleum vehicles. what Congress did a few years back to encourage Detroit to make flex fuel vehicles, it gave them an extra credit on their fuel efficiency standard if they made a certain number of flex fuel vehicles. So what they've done is they've made that certain number, but they've also made the rest of their fleet less efficient. So the government studies have found that we are actually burning more gasoline as a result of that loophole in the fuel efficiency standards. And the flex fuel vehicles are not getting us ahead at all. Certainly in Brazil, all of the car makers make flex fuel vehicles because they have 40% of their economy running on ethanol.
What about his concern about ethanol being made from sugar beets and biodiesel coming from cottonseed?
Right. Well, on the sugar beets, again, the studies that have been done have shown that at this point in the U.S., it wouldn't be as economic to do it from sugar beets. But I think that if there's a big crop in Michigan and other places, I think that it's something that people are going to start looking at. Biodiesel is made by a completely different process than ethanol, and it really looks very promising. And it could replace all of those trucks that are running on petroleum diesel. It could replace that in a very good clip. So it's definitely something worth looking at.
Stanford, Connecticut, you're on with Marianne Lavelle of U.S. News and World Report. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. Marianne, I had a couple of quick points that I'd like to perhaps bring out. The first is there's a bit of a moral issue using food stocks in order to fuel our vehicles, as opposed to something like gasoline or the biodiesel fuels, which I think are can be gotten from any plant, can be refined down. The second area that I thought was interesting is the fact that gasoline primarily is a problem here in the United States because we have been unable to build a refinery in 30 years. But things such as ethanol, you can expand the plants without virtually any opposition, and therefore you can get more product to market. I have unfortunately not yet had an opportunity to read your article, but did you touch on anything with regards to fuel from hydrogen fuel, in which case a clean burning fuel only emits water, and something that perhaps could be generated, let's say, along our coasts?
Right. We only just mentioned hydrogen as an alternative fuel that also is out. The problem with hydrogen is it's not here yet. And ethanol is here, and that's why it is being seen as really taking over the market for renewable fuels. I think you're absolutely right in what you said, that ethanol is, we do have this food versus fuel issue. And you're finding the food industry is starting to be very concerned about this. Ethanol now is taking about 20% of our corn production. And as a result, over the last a year to 6 months to a year, the price of corn has doubled. So what you have seen is all of the food producers are paying more for corn to feed cattle, to feed pigs, and that really is the main use of corn in the country. So the CEO of Tyson Foods, for instance, he's been most outspoken on this. He said the American consumers are making a choice. It's either food for fuel or food for feed. And so he says we're going to see meat prices increase, dairy prices, all prices for protein. And we haven't really seen it in a big way yet. But he says in the summer grilling season, the third quarter for Tyson's, you're going to see prices increase. And I think that will be due to the ethanol demand for corn.
Gaston, Oregon, on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning. My question is, because tobacco is creating so many health problems in this country, if we replaced our tobacco crops with hemp and legalized hemp, which hemp products are being imported from Canada, I don't know why it's still illegal in this country. The DuPonts and the Hearsts have made all the money they could possibly need. I want to know why there is not more interest in growing hemp to
Thank you very much. We're talking about the politics of ethanol. Unless you can tell us about any kind of fuel that's made from hemp, we'll move on.
You know what she may have been driving at the cellulosic ethanol, and let's talk a little bit about that. At its most simple, in its most simple terms, think of making ethanol from the corn husk instead of the corn grain. Any sort of plant material that is fibrous or reedy can be made into ethanol through biotechnology, really. And so instead of using heat, you're using really little germs to break down the material into the sugars that are made into alcohol. And cellulosic ethanol works in the laboratory. It is very expensive now, but if we got some plants online and if we really started producing it at commercial levels, the price would go down. So there's a lot of interest in doing that, and to deal with the food versus fuel issue that your previous caller talked about, because we would not be burning edible grain for fuel.
Next up is Arlington, Virginia, on our line for Democrats. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for the call. My question, and it may be a rhetorical question in this case, but why does it seem that the powers that be, whoever they are, always decide to back a fuel that is going to require, as in the case of oil, massive drilling, oil spills, all kinds of environmental havoc? In this case, we're, as the earlier caller pointed out, we're using a food stock instead of, why can't we put a Manhattan Project sort of behind, say, solar? We side all of our houses and put it all on all of our roofs. We plug our cars into our houses for local use, and we all sell power back to the grid rather than just further destroying the environment, further using something that's going to put more crap in the air, et cetera, et cetera. Why can't we get behind a solar solution to our energy needs?
Energy has been one of the most difficult things on Capitol Hill to deal with. When we talk to staffers on the Hill today, they talk about, even with the Democrats in charge, they think it's going to be hard to move toward what your caller is talking about, a Manhattan Project approach to energy, even though that's what's necessary. Energy is an issue where there are so many interests, and they are not only corporate interests, but regional interests, as you see with ethanol, that cross party lines. So it is very difficult to get a big energy bill that says this is a Manhattan Project on energy. We're going to really put everything we have at finding a solution that would get us off of oil. On Capitol Hill today, they're talking about doing smaller, more targeted energy measures. One of them would be in the Farm Bill addressing ethanol. But in the long run, maybe what we do need is a bigger picture look at this and things like solar that are truly completely renewable. Ethanol, no matter how you look at it, you are putting fossil energy into it to get renewable energy out.
How much is the cost of producing ethanol subsidized by the government at this point? And is that likely to change up or down during a democratically controlled Congress?
I don't see it changing really, because the Democrats support ethanol, the Republicans. The biggest subsidy right now is a 51-cent per gallon tax credit. And that actually doesn't go to the ethanol producers. It goes to the oil refiners. So we had the interesting situation last year where the oil refiners, the oil companies, who were flush with cash, they had the best year ever. We were sending $2.5 billion more tax dollars to them to mix ethanol as an incentive for them to mix ethanol. And really, they needed no incentive to do so for a lot of reasons. They wanted ethanol to make up the volume they were losing because of the refinery problems they've had, for example, and there were other reasons as well. So I don't see them changing the subsidies, but the interesting thing is if you want to see cellulosic ethanol compete with corn, something's going to have to be done to increase the incentive for cellulosic, which is much more expensive to make than corn ethanol.
The subject, politics of ethanol. Our guest, Marianne Lavelle of U.S. News and World Report. Next call comes from Orangeburg, South Carolina. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
I have a couple of questions. Is it not true that you can build a car that will run on plain alcohol, pure alcohol? Second question is, if you take and let the alcohol stand alone against the oil, even though it may be a little bit more expensive at first, would that not completely devalue the oil? And if it weren't for the tax, why would they want to mix the two fuels? And I'll wait for your answer.
With the car technology we have today, you can't run on pure alcohol. Ethanol is alcohol, by the way. It's nothing more than grain alcohol. You can run most cars on 10% ethanol, 10% alcohol. And to run any more than that, you need a special car, a flex fuel vehicle, and we really don't have enough of them on the roads today. You can run a diesel car or a diesel truck on pure biodiesel, so that may be what he's talking about. And that certainly would be a big boon. Again, biodiesel is still more expensive than plain old petroleum diesel. He's really referring to this chicken and egg problem, though. These alternative fuels are more expensive, but if they really took off in the marketplace, wouldn't the price go down, especially relative to oil? The problem is, the less oil we use, the lower the oil price goes, and so we have this problem, and we've seen it even this past year as oil prices went down a little bit in August. I think partially due to ethanol, partially due to weather. We until the last couple weeks we had very warm weather. The result is the price of oil goes down, and we kind of lose our will to reduce our oil dependence when the price goes down.
Among the crop of candidates who have announced or may announce their candidacy for the presidency, who is seen by the ethanol industry as their best friend?
You know, I haven't asked them in that way, but every one of these politicians will be talking about ethanol. Certainly, Governor Tom Vilsack of Iowa has been very strong on ethanol, but even Senator John McCain, who in the past has been very critical of any sort of government pork, and he has been very critical of ethanol subsidies in the past, he now says it's worth taking a closer look. And he avoided Iowa in the last presidential campaign. He will be there this year. Senator Hillary Clinton has talked about pouring federal money into ethanol research. She will probably be talking about cellulosic ethanol, as will Senator Obama. So you're going to hear, it's almost, the way we put it, it's hard to find a sparring partner on Capitol Hill when you're talking about ethanol.
Dallas, Texas, good morning.
Good morning. I'm afraid the lady got the lobbyist tour on ethanol. E85 gets about a third of the gas mileage. If you wanted to run the E85 ethanol, you can get a third of the mileage as you would running gasoline. During the highest peak of the gasoline, ethanol was costing $1 a gallon more on the wholesale market than was pure gas. Ethanol is more polluting than pure gasoline. I'm not a gas fan, but I think you got the lobby tour and not the fact tour. Alcohol, the ethanol alcohol is so corrosive it cannot be put in pipes, so it has to be trucked in tankers everywhere it goes. There is a 51-cent tariff on Brazilian crude, so there's actually $1 of incentive for the refiners to run that. It's a ConAgra ADM pork. The fact that we've got a why is Iowa a farm state that's determining what presidential candidates we get? Ethanol is a bad business decision, and we need to find good solutions, but ethanol's not it. And the cellulosic is a different. There's nothing about it, and running it from corn is the worst idea of all. Yeah, ADM and ConAgra have huge influence, and I wish you'd listen to Ed Wallace, who's written for Business Week. He actually has a radio show here, but I think he's so far been the best non-biased source of information on that I've found.
Yeah, our story actually does talk about this cost. Consumer Reports found that you were actually paying $1 a gallon more if you ran E85 in your car last year because you have to use so much more fuel. Ethanol does not take you as far as gasoline does, and that's one of the reasons that it has been more costly.
So then what's the incentive to use ethanol? It seems like it's more costly to put in your car. You can't find the cars that run it.
That run on it totally.
Right. And it costs more to make than gasoline. So where is the plus in having ethanol on the market to begin with?
First of all, we definitely the homegrown fuel aspect, the idea of taking volume away. The other thing that's far more complicated is that the oil industry has needed something to boost the octane of gasoline. That's a very big factor in ethanol use. Do you know what the oil industry used to use was lead to boost octane? Octane making the gasoline combust more efficiently. For a while, the oil industry was using a petroleum product called MTBE. And that worked okay for the air pollution problems, and that gave the gasoline the octane boost it needed, and it also it improved some of the air pollution problems. But it was a terrible water pollutant, and it caused all sorts of drinking water problems throughout New England, through California, and the states began banning MTBE. The oil industry needed a replacement quick. Ethanol replaced MTBE very well, and that was really in the year 2000 when you saw that slow growth of ethanol really begin, and it just took off in the last 2 years because oil prices were so high that ethanol became, the economics just were great, and that's what led us to the ethanol situation we're in now.
The politics of ethanol with St. Charles, Missouri on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning, enjoying the conversation. I think this goes back to your previous call-in show, too. What it is, it's about votes. I mean, let's get serious. That's all it comes down to is political votes. And somebody's got to get the word out that it is costing us money. It is nowhere near cost-effective to use ethanol. And that's going to hurt us jobs, it's going to hurt our economy, and it's going to take us longer to get out of debt, especially when we're subsidizing something that is more expensive. It just makes no sense whatsoever, other than it's a good political soundbite, and it will get people votes because it makes them look like, we're for America, we're not for Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia provides us with our cheapest, most cost-effective type of fuel that we have in the world, and without it, we would really have problems.
I wanted to go back to something the previous caller said as well. He talked about ethanol being corrosive. This is one of the reasons that we have no pipelines to take ethanol from where it's made to where it's used. We have big pipelines that move gasoline from the Gulf Coast up to the population centers in the East and the Midwest. If we really continue on the path we're on to making more and more ethanol. And we really are on that path, and it was part of the State of the Union address, and the Democrats are behind it too. We are going to come up with some very big transportation problems on ethanol. Right now, it is mostly transported by rail. You can hear some of the folks who ship by rail talking about the prices they're paying because there's so much demand for rail service now, freight rail. And there are all of these sort of nitty-gritty infrastructure problems that no one likes to deal with. But really moving ethanol across the country, if you move it by truck, well, you're going to be burning diesel fuel the whole way. Unless of course, you use biodiesel, which again is more expensive at this point.
How does the Bush administration, headed up arguably by two oilmen, see the use of ethanol in terms of lessening U.S. dependence on foreign oil?
Well, you know, there are plenty of Republicans who are in favor of ethanol, and a lot of the ethanol industry has a lot of powerful Republicans as well. So you have to see this as you can't look at the administration as just pro-oil in this area. I mean, the president has talked about reducing our oil addiction, and he's looking at the industry that's out there now in the U.S. and the one successful alternative energy industry we have that is up and running, that is really out there active now, is the ethanol industry.
Next up is Sarasota, Florida, on our line for Independence. Good morning.
Good morning. There are a few issues I'd like to bring up very quickly. The corrosive issue, the marine industry in the United States has warned all marine engine users to be careful of using ethanol because it's so corrosive, and that goes for generators, any kind of engine that's run on gasoline. But calling from Florida, I'd like to bring up the issue of the sugar industry and phosphate mining, which would feed directly into more pollution problems, and all of us in this country are dealing with pollution problems. And I keep wondering, how can Honda and Toyota come up with cars with incredibly good fuel economy, and that's not happening here? So I feel like our current administration's denying research and technology and science is causing this problem to be just another boondoggle for making money.
Really, fuel economy is the key. If all of the cars had the gas mileage of the Prius, for instance, we would reduce our oil dependence far quicker than by producing more and more corn ethanol. This has been a hard thing for us to deal with. It's been hard for Congress to really address. I think this in the State of the Union address, the President talked about really a commitment to increasing fuel economy. That is something that has to be done in a far more aggressive way, whether we use ethanol or not, because we really the fuel economy of the new cars today is worse than the fuel economy of the cars that came out of Detroit in '88. So we're going backwards on this when we should be going forwards, and it is really the fastest way. The technology is there already. It is the way to reduce oil dependence.
Next up is Yardley, Pennsylvania, on our line for Republicans. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, sir.
Use my speakerphone.
Thanks.
The lady said about ethanol boosting octane, and my understanding, and I could be wrong about the octane, is that it's an oxygenator for the fuel, not an octane booster. And I just don't understand how the EPA feels that they're getting less pollution with, just with lower mileage. In other words, I don't see how the oxygen boost can actually offset the horribly lower mileage. I drive a Prius, and when I went out in the Midwest, I think I got ethanol 20%, and my mileage dropped 5 or 10 miles a gallon from maybe 50.
Sorry.
By the way, you definitely don't want to get 20% ethanol when you're driving a Prius or any of those other cars, because they cannot really take more than 10% ethanol. There may be some debate about that, but you're risking damaging your vehicle if you do anything more than 10% on a car that's not a flex fuel car. Ethanol both boosts the octane, it's an oxygenate, it does both. And it makes the gasoline burn more fully. So you have fewer of some of the pollutants that we worry about with gasoline. But he's absolutely right. You have a trade-off because you're getting fewer miles out of the fuel you buy. So again, we are in this dilemma when we use ethanol.
Our last call for Marianne Lavelle comes from Iowa City, Iowa. Good morning.
Hi, I just wanted to say that most cars today are about 9-to-1 compression. If you raise the compression ratio to, say, 14-to-1, which you can do with E85, which has a pump octane of 105, you increase the efficiency about 4% per octane point, or per compression point. I just want to mention that. Thank you very much.
They actually, GM sells one car in Europe that actually would get better mileage using E85. We don't have that technology here in the United States at all. The technology is available to get better mileage with ethanol by taking advantage of the octane issue with ethanol.
Marianne Lavelle of U.S. News and World Report, thank you very much for being on the program. The article is the cover story in the February 12th edition, special report, Overselling Ethanol. You can still read that online.
That's right.
At www.usnews.com. Thank you again.
Thank you.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll be talking with Eric O'Neill, a former FBI agent who worked on the Robert Hansen spy case and is the subject of the new movie Breach. We'll be right back.
A discussion on the Bush presidency and White House press coverage is coming up tonight. Press Secretary Tony Snow is joined by a panel of members of the White House Press Corps, including NBC's David Gregory, Terry Hunt of the Associated Press, Mark Knoller with CBS News, and Cheryl Stolberg of the New York Times. That's live at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. Middle and high school students, get your entries ready for C-SPAN's 2007 Student Cam National Video Competition. Pick a current political topic of interest to you, and using some C-SPAN video, produce a video documentary of 10 minutes or less. The grand prize winner will receive $3,000, and 45 prizes will be awarded overall, with the top entries airing on the C-SPAN networks. To learn more and for entry forms, go to studentcam.org. Entries must be received no later than March 30th. C-SPAN's 2007 Student Cam National Video Competition. What political issue matters to you? On C-SPAN and online, Capitol News provides timely and relevant updates about Congress, politics, and public affairs. Look for Capitol News updates every 15 minutes at the bottom of your screen throughout the day. And find out more about the stories behind the headlines, along with video of the day's highlights, online at capitalnews.org. On C-SPAN and online, let Capitol News keep you up to date on what's happening in Washington, politics, and around the world. Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Eric O'Neill, former FBI agent who was a major factor in cracking the Robert Hansen spy case and is one of the characters featured in the movie Breach. We're going to take a look at a clip where Agent O'Neill is told that he's going to be working with Agent Hansen, who is a spy. We'll take a look at that clip and then we'll come back and talk with Eric O'Neill.
You know, I think this whole thing is cooked. I think he keeps shooting his mouth off about the Bureau and nobody knows what to do with him, so we tag him as a deviant and run him out of the building. It's bull... The whole thing. It's Kenneth Starr all over again, except I'm running around looking for the blue dress.
come to admire him, I see.
Yes.
Respect him?
Yes.
Well, that was inevitable. For our purposes, it was sort of necessary. He's a traitor, Eric. Started spying for the Russians, we think, in 1985. He's given them military secrets, intelligence secrets. He gave them our continuity of government program, which told them where the president would be taken during a nuclear or terrorist attack. The damage he's done to the U.S. government is in the billions. But that's just the money part. He's also given up lives.